The captain of the British fleet penned a letter to his wife. The bomb vessels, brigs and frigates are all pushing up the river with an eagerness which must annoy the enemy, I presume, as much as it delights me. The enemy was annoyed, but ready. When the British entered the mouth of the Patapsco River at noon on September 11th, the American alarm gun sounded. And Baltimore's church bells called the militia to arms. The British were planning a two-pronged attack on the city, both by sea and by land. On September 12th, General Robert Ross led the landing of British troops at North Point, Maryland, and began the 12-mile march west toward Baltimore. Ross hoped it would be a repeat of the invasion of Washington, but it wouldn't be that easy.
The British only had about 4,500 troops. They believed they were up against nearly as many as 20,000 troops crowded into Baltimore. And although they held American military abilities in low regard, it was a different situation from what it had been in Washington.
This time, the inexperienced American militia managed to hold off their battle-tested enemy for hours. The British suffered heavy casualties during 2 days of fighting. One of their greatest losses was General Robert Ross himself, killed by an American bullet through the chest. The following day, the British commanders decided to cut their losses and give up the push toward Baltimore. The British land strategy was all but over. Their only hope was the naval assault, but the Navy was having troubles of its own. Back on the Patapsco River, the American forces had sunk 24 of their own valuable merchant ships across the mouth of the river's northwest branch, blocking the water route to the city's inner harbor. It was a precious sacrifice, but an essential defensive strategy. Now, the only way the British could get to the city would be to capture Fort McHenry. But the fort was ready for them. Commander George Armistead knew it was coming. On September 12th, he wrote to General Samuel Smith, the commander of Baltimore, "From the number of barges and the known situation of the enemy, I have not a doubt but that an assault will be made this night upon the fort." The smaller of Mary Pickersgill's two flags was proudly hoisted above the fort, and 1,000 soldiers took position behind the 57 naval guns mounted on the water batteries. In the early morning hours of September 13, 1814, the HMS Volcano sent the first bombs sailing towards the fort. The ship's guns had a firing range of 2 miles. The fort's only a mile and a half.
So for most of the bombardment, the small garrison here at Fort McHenry could only wait out the bombardment by huddling up against the north face of the walls of the fort on the other side, away from the harbor.
As one American wrote, "We're like pigeons tied by the legs to be shot at." The shelling lasted for 25 hours. British Congreve rockets screamed toward the fort, leaving red trails of light in their wake. 190-pound cast-iron bombs exploded in midair, sending heavy fragments down upon the fort. One British soldier described it in a letter to his wife. All this night, the bombardment continued with unabated vigor. The hissing of rockets and the fiery shells glittered in the air, threatening destruction as they fell. From 8 miles away, an anxious Francis Scott Key helplessly watched the bombs sail again and again towards Fort McHenry. There was no way to tell if the American flag was still flying. Early on the morning of September 14, 1814, after firing over 1,500 shells and 700 rockets, the British bomb ships finally began to turn away from Fort McHenry. The land troops at North Point retreated back to the water's edge. The assault on Baltimore had failed.
They needed combined successful land and naval operations, and they could never work out a way of putting them together. And when they realized that, they gave it up and withdrew.
One British midshipman wrote, "We retired down the Patapsco River with far different sensations from those we experienced upon entering it." In the distance, Francis Scott Key heard the soldiers at Fort McHenry triumphantly fire the morning gun.
Armistead, the commander of the fort, ordered the small flag taken down, and in its place he ordered the great 42 by 30-foot garrison flag that we see today at the Smithsonian in Washington, hoisted over the ramparts of the fort as the last measure of defiance against the British fleet.
A fife and drum band broke into a celebratory rendition of Yankee Doodle. And 8 miles away, Francis Scott Key peered through the eyepiece of a telescope, straining to see anything through the thick smoke and fog. Miraculously, the fort had survived, and a huge American flag was still flying triumphantly. Greatly moved, Key began to jot down the first stanza of what we know today as our national anthem.
As the morning sun rose, he could dimly see the American flag. And that's when he exclaimed, "'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner, may it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." And at that time he started writing the rest of the poem.
Back at Fort McHenry, the troops were celebrating their momentous victory. Only 4 men were killed and 24 wounded. They'd beaten the British again.
Of course, it provided a great burst of patriotism because the country was in great disarray. The capital had fallen. The president was managing ineffectively. The cabinet was divided. The treasury was broke. The army wasn't performing any too well. The coast was blockaded. But by God, before we go down to defeat, we'll rally every last man and fight it out, you see.
In December 1814, the United States and Britain signed their final peace treaty at Ghent, Belgium. It did more than just end the war. It proved to the great powers of Europe that America would not be pushed around. We had gained respect abroad and taken our place on the world stage. And with that came a sense of national pride that the country had never had before.
We come out of this war with a sense of who we are. The American character is actually born, I believe, during the War of 1812. We are Americans now, and to prove it to you, take a look at my flag.
The War of 1812 is often pushed aside in American history. It's a war in which we gained no territory, forged no new boundaries, liberated no allies. What it did give us was a sense of national identity, and eventually our national anthem. Yet some say that Francis Scott Key never even saw the flag that day. That weather conditions, thick smoke, and Key's distance from the fort would have blocked his view of the flag.
If you read the national anthem, he talks about the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Well, that gave proof is the key word. Now, you have to remember Key's a Washington lawyer. And so he's using a little bit of poetic license here. He doesn't need to see the flag to know it's there. He knows it's there.
Whether or not Key actually saw the flag didn't matter to the people of Baltimore. His words were an inspiration. The morning after he returned to the city, Key's verses were printed into a handbill and distributed to the joyful citizens of Baltimore.
Here was something that could be held onto in words that expressed how all of the people must have felt. They had defended their city, they had defended their state, and they had beaten the foe.
The handbill called the poem Defense of Fort McHenry and said it should be sung to the tune of Anacreon in Heaven. The well-known tune was a drinking song made popular by a London social club. Key had written an earlier poem to the same music.
It was a tune that everybody knew because it was so familiar. And so when you're striking at the music, well, you don't have to be able to read music. It's to the tune of To Anacreon in Heaven. Oh, okay. So everybody's plugged in immediately.
Within days, the local papers had published Key's verses. The editor of one paper predicted the song would long outlast the occasion and outlive the impulse which produced it. Only a month later, sheet music was printed giving the song a new title, The Star-Spangled Banner. And before long, the melody was a favorite in taverns, theaters, and homes.
It just had this tremendous effect in a way somewhat like the Iwo Jima flag raising had in the Second World War, where everything that America stood for somehow became summed up in that flag and those circumstances.
Francis Scott Key's poem remained popular throughout the 19th century. In the 1880s, John Philip Sousa, the bandmaster of the U.S. Marines, led his band around the world, performing the Star-Spangled Banner wherever they went. In 1889, the Secretary of the Navy ordered that the song be used at morning flag-raising ceremonies. And soon after, the Army decreed that its soldiers should stand at attention when the song was played. But it was still not designated the national anthem.
Nations did not have official national anthems in the 19th century. There were pieces of music that were played on official occasions, but the Parliament of England, for instance, has never actually made God Save the Queen an official national anthem. The Star-Spangled Banner was one of several songs that were played on official occasions.
But by 1912, World War I was brewing in Europe, and America's involvement on a world stage seemed likely. It was clear we needed one official song. So that year, congressmen from various states began introducing bills that would make the Star-Spangled Banner our official national anthem. But none of the bills got very far. Criticism was fierce. Opponents claimed that the song had words that nobody could remember and a tune that nobody could sing. What matter the words, retorted composer John Philip Sousa. The spirit is what counts. No true American can fail to be stirred when it is played. The issue was passionately debated for nearly 20 years, but finally the beauty and familiarity of Francis Scott Key's poem won out. President Herbert Hoover signed a law on March 3, 1931, making the Star-Spangled Banner our national anthem.
We are such an extraordinary accomplishment in human history, but we need national symbols, we need ways of coming together as a nation, and an anthem that we sing at ball games and patriotic events is something that every American should know and every American should respect, because it is part of defining who we are as a whole, as one nation, as one America.
The enormous garrison flag that had inspired Francis Scott Key had by this time taken on almost folkloric proportions. With no royal family and no common cultural background, Americans had precious few symbols in common. This beautiful flag was one of them.
It embraces all of us regardless of background, regardless of our personal history, and embraces everything in this country. It takes in our entire history. And so, in that way, this is an artifact that not only connects to all of us, but it ties us together. It's a symbol of unity, and I think for those reasons, it's extraordinarily powerful.
For nearly 100 years, the Star-Spangled Banner remained with the family of Lieutenant Colonel George Armistead, the commander of Fort McHenry. The small red V that appears on the stripe used to be the A in the name Armistead. One of the family members began to sew the letters onto the flag, but never finished. At the same time, the family was more than willing to share the flag with others, and quite literally they did.
Not too many weeks after the battle, one of the soldiers associated with it died, natural causes, and his widow asked the commander for a piece of the flag under which he served to bury with him, and so he cut off a piece. And so once you start that, everybody wants a piece. But obviously it survived because it was in private hands and because these people treasured it and took care of it.
In 1907, Armistead's grandson lent the family's cherished flag to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. for display. By that time, almost 8 of the original 42 feet were missing, as well as one of the 15 stars. 5 years later, in 1912, the Star-Spangled Banner was officially donated to the museum. For over 90 years, the Smithsonian Institution has cared for one of America's most treasured flags. But now time has taken its toll. As the world prepares to enter the new millennium, the National Museum of American History will complete a 3-year preservation so that the Star-Spangled Banner can continue to be an inspiration.